So today we're going to talk about the Oracle Critical Patch Update, October 2011, and specifically focus in on the Oracle eBusiness Suite impact. So from that perspective, it will be the Oracle Database, the Oracle Application Server, and also the Oracle eBusiness Suite. As you know, the Critical Patch Updates include patches for all three, and we'll kind of go through those as we discuss the Critical Patch Update for this quarter. So to give you a little overview of myself, I've been working with the Oracle applications for quite a few years and focusing in on security for the last 12. And to give you some background about Integrity, we're focused in on the Oracle eBusiness Suite and security. That's kind of our key job. And we also do on-site security assessments on design work related to the Oracle eBusiness Suite and security. And we also have two products, one of them AppSentry, that automates a lot of what we do in terms of our security assessments. And also we'll go through and check for security settings such as if critical patch updates are installed. We also have a tool called AppDefend, which acts as an intrusion prevention system for the business suite in case you're deploying it to the internet. So enough about Integrity. So we'll focus the rest of the session on the critical patch update for October. Kind of delve into different aspects of it. Usually one of the first questions we do get is, how do you know so much about the critical patch updates? Well, here at Integrity, we spend a lot of time doing research and development, and here's a little list of some of the 72 security vulnerabilities that we found or reported to Oracle over the last 6 years and have been fixed through critical patch updates. So we understand them basically because we find a lot of the bugs that Oracle is fixing. And we understand why they occur, and we also do a lot of due diligence and research and development related to each quarter's patches in terms of what vulnerabilities are fixed and the best way to apply the patches, etc. So in today's session, we'll give you a little bit of background about the Oracle CPUs in general. They've been going on for 28 quarters. We'll kind of discuss about some of the key features that you should know, what's included in an Oracle CPU and how it works. Then we'll specifically talk about some of the vulnerabilities fixed this quarter. Then we'll talk about patches and which patches are available and kind of some of the nuances of each patch. And then finally, we'll talk about a patching strategy that's different than Oracle's patching strategy, something that we're trying to push our customers to in order to get the critical patch updates applied as quickly as possible. And then finally, for the last 15 minutes, we'll open up to some questions and answers. So we'll start off talking about the background of the CPUs and give you a little bit more information so you understand what the CPUs are and what's actually fixed them. So Oracle's been releasing CPUs for the last 28 quarters, and so it started in January 2005. And Oracle moved to a fixed quarterly schedule in 2005 because customers were complaining before that. All of a sudden you'd get an email saying, oh, security patches come out, you need to apply it right away. And what Oracle has done is move to this quarterly schedule that hopefully avoids month-end close, quarter-end close, year-end closes, periods, and gives you a fixed, rigorous schedule so you know, moving out for the next year at least, exactly when these security patches are going to be released, and you can put it into your planning cycles. So we know now that the next two CPUs are going to be January 17th, 2012 and April 17th, 2012. So there's been 28 CPUs released since 2005, and an astounding 1,300 security bugs fixed across all those CPUs. These numbers have normalized for basically the standard Oracle products, so they don't include the Sun products at all and some other acquisitions. So these are mostly Oracle eBusiness Suite, Oracle Database, Oracle Fusion Middleware, which used to be Oracle Application Server. So in the database, there's been 425 bugs fixed, and in the eBusiness Suite, 229. When you think about those numbers, any one of those bugs can actually compromise your entire database. So there are a lot of bugs out there. If you aren't keeping up with the CPUs, there's a lot of potential vulnerabilities in your application environment. To look at these numbers a little bit differently, what I've done is kind of graphed out over a quarter how many database bugs were fixed and how many eBusiness Suite bugs. So the bar chart's showing in blue how many database bugs each quarter, and the red one shows the eBusiness Suite bugs. As you can see, the numbers of bugs per quarter are diminishing, but really not going to zero. And so there's at least 10 to 15 bugs being fixed each quarter, and we anticipate that going forward for at least the next 1 or 2 years. So if you don't have a repeatable process today for fixing CPU vulnerabilities, these are going to continue for at least the next 8 quarters, if not further on. The squiggly lines in the upper left show actually the severity of the bugs, and we'll talk about the CVSF scores in a little bit. But those are just showing the basic severity on a scale of 1 to 10. And so you can see it's fairly consistent. It's up and down. But anything really over 7 for the database is a very severe vulnerability. And anything over 3.5 or 4 for the EBusiness suite can be a severe vulnerability and allow compromise of the entire data. So in general, there's at least one severe bug released each quarter. So always keep that in mind. Even though there may not seem to be, there always is at least one bug that can compromise the entire database fairly easily. So let's talk about some of the things that have happened with the CPUs over time. So some recent changes that you need to be aware of is that the Oracle EBusiness Suite 11i patches are now cumulative only. So starting in January 2011 and onward, prior to that period, the EBusiness Suite patches were one-off patches, and so each vulnerability was fixed by one patch. Now the patches are cumulative. This has a major impact for a number of customers who are running on the internet, modules like iRecruitment and iSupplier, because what would happen before is if you had to patch those specific modules on the internet, but you didn't want to maybe touch the accounts payable or general ledger that might be also included in the CPU patch, you could do that. Now the CPU patches are one large patch. For 11i, RUP 6, and RUP 7, the patches are over 100 megabytes. So there is a lot of things in that patch that are all security fixes, but may impact your environment, may require more testing than you're used to. So you do need to keep that in mind if you haven't applied a EBusiness Suite CPU patch since 2011 or in this year, that they're now cumulative and a little bit more testing is probably required. Another minor change in the last few quarters was that Oracle is adding in a high-level summary as part of the CPU. There's really no more content in that high-level summary. That just kind of gives you some basic text. So if you want to give your CIO a little bit more information, it's actually a good place to start. Again, no more information, but it's nice for the higher-up executive types. And I'll now talk about a couple areas that people aren't that familiar with when they're talking about the CPUs. One is the entire process and how it works, and there's a couple caveats that you need to be aware of. So the Oracle CPU process works and starts by either a customer, like yourselves, or a security researcher, like Integrity, reports a bug to Oracle. Oracle researches a bug, develops a fix, and then includes that fix in the main code line first. So a key aspect of when you're doing upgrades and things, if you're upgrading to the latest and greatest Oracle database patch level that was recently released before a CPU, that patch will actually include hidden security fixes because Oracle fixes it in the main code line first. So if you just upgraded to 11.203 for the database, you actually receive a number of hidden security fixes that aren't documented in there because Oracle fixes it in the main code line and then backports it to all the previous versions. And by backporting for just the database alone, there's over 70 patches that they have to create. So that process can take a while. So when you're talking about submitting a bug to Oracle and having it fixed, that period can be from 3 months to 3 years. Integrity has a number of bugs open currently that are 2 to 3 years old that Oracle still hasn't fixed because it's all prioritizing, working with different versions, trying to backport, and things like that. So it can take a while. The average bug time has been dropping over the last couple of years. So some kudos to Oracle for that, but it still can take 3, 6, 9 months for a bug to be fixed. And a number of people are still complaining that bugs are open 2 or 3 years. So keep in mind that once a bug is reported to Oracle, it may sit around for a while before it actually gets fixed. This isn't a 30-day fix window. This could be up to a 3-year fix window. Another aspect about the critical patch updates that we get a lot of questions is they include a score, and I'll kind of walk through those in a second while showing you the actual vulnerability matrices. But there's a score called the CVSF Score. And the CVSF Score is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And this is a metric on a scale of 1 to 10 that was designed by a number of security companies to provide an easy way to compare security vulnerabilities across products. So Oracle uses this, or IBM, Microsoft, Symantec. So all the large companies are all using CVSF scores. So you can actually compare an operating system security bug to an Oracle one and see which one's more important. Unfortunately, there is a major issue with the way the CVSF scores are calculated. And they were designed by people who are operating system and network people, not by database experts. And the key is to get a 10, you have to be able to exploit the entire machine. Again, obtain root access. So if I can compromise your server and get root access, I can do a 10. If I can't get root access but take over your entire database, well, that's only a 6.5. So even though I can steal all your data, take over your database, but I can very seldom ever take over the root account with an Oracle security vulnerability, the maximum security vulnerability for an Oracle database will probably only be a 6.5. And there's been a lot of people in blog posts saying, oh, Oracle's messing with the CVSF numbers. They're way too low for Oracle. They should be higher. It's really not Oracle's problem. It's really the way the metric works. And where this will come in and impact you is if you're ever talking to your IT security professional within your organization and say, oh, we've got all these critical Oracle security vulnerabilities. We can take over the entire database, and they're all 6.5. He's going to say, well, our standard's not to patch anything under 7 immediately. We'll do that against the next important release cycle. So again, even though the Oracle scores are low, they are still very critical vulnerabilities. So when you're looking through these risk matrices and you're seeing 6.5 and 5.5, those are still very important. And what Oracle has done to kind of compensate for this a little bit is they actually put partial plus, and I'll show you where those occur, saying, oh, you can take over the entire database with this, even though the metric says it's a little bit lower. So what we'll do is right now is jump out very quickly to an actual risk matrix and kind of show you what we here at Integrity will look at. So I've gone out now to Oracle's site. So if you go search in Oracle Security Alerts on Google, it'll pop you right to this page, or basically it's under the security tabs on the Oracle main page. And we kind of scroll through this a little bit. I'm going to show you some of the highlights. One of the key aspects is Oracle is telling you immediately what dates the next 4 CPUs will be released in. So this is kind of nice to know. So when you're doing your planning and release cycles and trying to include CPUs proactively, Oracle's told you for the next few quarters actually when those will be released. We'll scroll down a little bit more. And so then each quarter, each CPU is listed out. So we'll actually go into this quarter's CPU. And most of the CPU is actually boilerplate. So one of the key aspects, first thing to look at is the versions. A lot of the text we kind of skip over very quickly because it really doesn't provide much more value. But if you're now looking at the versions, the first thing you'll see is here's the database. The Oracle has been very aggressive in actually supporting a very limited set of Oracle database versions for each CPU. So anything that's released in the last 18 months is supported, but for a specific patch set on the database, it's only supported for 18 months unless it's a terminal release. So you can see, unless you're upgrading actively, your database version will not be supported. And Oracle has continued on with this and has been very aggressive in trying to keep that moving forward. And we'll kind of scroll through this, and I'll go immediately now down to the risk matrices, because that's really the key aspect of the actual security alert. And so Oracle will include a number of pieces of information. And here you can see the CVSF scores. And so when we're walking through this, the first thing we'll look at is the CVE score, or the CVE number. And the CVE number is a standard numbering scheme that's maintained nationally, or actually internationally, by a group, and they assign each vulnerability that's found in almost every product in the world a unique CVE score. And so if you look up that number in Google, you'll actually find more information about the specific vulnerability. And the reason this is used is so all security researchers, all companies, everyone can refer to this vulnerability with kind of a common name, and you can refer to it as the same thing. Otherwise, before the CVE scores, everyone's like, well, what about that security vulnerability? And people would really have to describe it in order to find it. Now, with the CVE score, or the CVE number, it's very easy to refer to. The next thing we look at is really the component in the protocol. The component will tell you if it's something you're running. Traditionally, Oracle has fixed most of the core RDBMS bugs, and recently a lot of the vulnerabilities have shown up in ancillary products. In this case, 2 out of the 5 components fixed in this CPU were actually in database fault. Unless you're running database fault, there's only actually 2 vulnerabilities that will really impact you. So 2 are database fault, 1 is application express. So in this quarter, for most customers, there's only actually 2 security vulnerabilities that you really have to spend a lot of time worrying about, and that will be the core EBMS one and the Oracle text. And depending on what you're running in your database, Oracle text may not even be installed. The next thing to look at is actually the privileges that it requires. So here, you need execute on a very specific package that may be granted to public, it may not be. Then also here, this Oracle core EBMS really just needs create session, create procedure, and create table in order to exploit it. So someone with very limited privileges, they can connect to the database, they can create some of their own objects, but they can't do much else, can actually then take over the entire database. So we look at the CVE definitions. Confidentiality means I can read all data. Integrity means I can insert or update data. So even though this is a 5.5 on a scale of 10, I can actually go through and read and write all data in the database by using very limited permissions. So that's kind of to give you an example of how severe these vulnerabilities are. Even though they're on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 5.5. This is a pretty severe vulnerability that with limited permissions, I can actually do a lot in your database. This one is an 8.5, and here it says complete, and there's actually a note here. So when you look at the CVSF scores here, there's an aspect in that if you're running on Windows, it's much easier to compromise the administrator account than actually compromise the root on Linux and Unix. So the reason this one is a complete is because on a Windows box, a server running Oracle, I can actually take over probably the administrator account, but on Linux and Unix, I can only compromise the Oracle account itself. So on Unix and Linux, these are actually partial pluses, but so I can take over the entire database. I just can't take over the entire server. So those are some of the aspects that we're looking at when we're actually going through the CPU. We kind of jump down a little bit farther for the Oracle EBusiness Suite. One of the key aspects that we're looking at is still the same thing, the same type of values are here. But one of them is remotely exploitable without authentication. This is a very key column when you're looking at Oracle EBusiness Suite bugs. Because what this is telling you is, do I need an application sign-on, or can I just basically connect to the web server and issue a URL and actually do something? So again, partial plus doesn't really apply here for the EBusiness Suite, but basically partial ratings means I can write potentially data to your EBusiness Suite environment. These are actually all cross-site scripting bugs for the most part. One of them actually being just I can read data that I shouldn't be able to read. But again, these are the type of vulnerabilities that are fixed and how easy they are to exploit. And even though I can kind of write data or read a lot of different data, I'm getting very low scores. And that's just partially the way the CVSF scores work. So that's kind of a brief overview of the way the vulnerability assessments or matrices work, and so just give you some information about what we look at as we go through them each quarter. So that was an overview of kind of this quarter's matrices and some of the things that we look at when we think about the CPUs. And now we'll talk about some of the specific vulnerabilities. So as we work through that chart, there was one in Oracle Application Express, which is not typically installed in the Oracle EBusiness Suite environment, so we won't talk about it here. And so there's really 4 different database vulnerabilities you have to be concerned about this quarter. If you're not running database vault, there's actually 2, and both those have basically public permissions or requiring very limited permissions to be able to connect to the database, and you can take over the entire database. And they're both actually in libraries. So when we talk about the fix for these, so the top 2 vulnerabilities here, the one in Oracle Text and the one in Oracle Core RDBMS, the fix is actually just one library file. And so there's some sort of security vulnerability in that library file, and what's most likely a buffer overflow, which meant was the coder, when he was actually coding up the C language, was anticipating someone sending him maybe 100 characters of information. And so basically he processes that 100 characters of information. Unfortunately, if someone sends 255 characters and that can manipulate it and send exactly what they want, they can actually execute code. And so if they can write a assembler code that they can send in through just basically calling a package or something, you can actually execute that. And that's what basically buffer overflow is. And therefore, that's executing as the Oracle account on in the operating system of the database server. So I can actually start doing things at the operating system level, deleting files, creating files, changing logins, that type of thing. So buffer overflows are a little bit more difficult to exploit, but still very powerful. And very easy to exploit if someone actually does the work for you and publishes on the internet, and you can find it via Google, which happens typically for 1 or 2 security vulnerabilities each quarter. The database fault issues for anyone running database fault, there's a number of issues in database fault in terms of security bugs that have been found in the last probably 4 or 5 quarters. And database vault's purpose is to block access by privileged database users from accessing data they shouldn't. Unfortunately, Oracle hasn't done that perfectly well, and therefore each quarter they're finding some issues where I can actually circumvent database fault. Even though I'm a privileged user, database fault should be blocking me from accessing certain data. Well, unfortunately, there's some bugs in that process and some things that Oracle didn't think about, and therefore I can actually access data, change users' passwords, things like that I shouldn't. And that's what these bugs are for this quarter. So that's kind of an overview of the database bugs. When I talk about the patches, I'll actually talk about the eBusiness Suite bugs in a little bit more detail. One of the areas that we find a lot of problems with when people are applying the critical patch updates and doing upgrades is when you do an upgrade, you have to remember that you're actually resetting the Oracle database and Oracle eBusiness Suite CPU patch levels back to the version that was available when that patch came out. So as an example, when I have 11.203, and I'm doing my upgrade, and I might be doing it right now, or I might be doing it in 6 months, when I apply that patch, the version contained in that patch for the CPU is July 2011. So when I apply that next year, potentially, I'm actually reverting my code. Even though I might have applied a later CPU, I'm reverting it back to July 2011. The same thing happens if, let's say today I'm running 12.1.1 of the Oracle eBusiness Suite. I might have applied the Oracle 2011 CPU. When I upgrade to 12.1.3, it's actually changing code back to January 2011. So whenever I do a major upgrade, either at the database or the eBusiness Suite, I actually have to reapply the latest CPU. And a lot of people miss that. It's very common to see that, oh yeah, we did our upgrade. Did you apply the latest CPU? Oh no, we applied that on the previous version. When you apply an upgrade, even a minor version upgrade, it is resetting the CPU because the way the code works in the patch, it's just overwriting the code that's there. And it happens especially in the database. On the eBusiness Suite, it happens, but there are some circumstances that it won't happen. So it's more 50-50, but on the database, every single vulnerability that you had patched prior will be overrun with old code that is vulnerable. So you do always have to keep that one in mind. Another aspect that's hitting a lot of our clients, and when we have discussions with our clients on conference calls, they always talk about they're getting stuck because they can't potentially upgrade the database at a certain time because of business requirements, application upgrade requirements, and things like that. And so what happens is they're unable to apply database CPU patches because they're on an older version. And this chart shows you the database version and what the terminal CPU is. So if you're running 10.204, there is no October 2011 CPU patch. The last CPU patch available for 10.204 is July 2011. If you look at some of these dates, they could come up very quickly. 11.201, a lot of people just upgraded to 11.2. Well, July 2011 was the last CPU patch for 11.201. So you might have just done your upgrade, and because of testing cycles, weren't able to apply 11.202. Well, unfortunately for the October 2011 CPU, you aren't able to apply the CPU patches this quarter. So these dates are hitting people more often than they think. And then also look at 11.202. You might have already just upgraded to 11.202. Well, next year, July 2012 is the last CPU patch. 11.203 just came out. So Oracle is keeping to their 18-month schedule that if a database version is older than 18 months, there are no CPU patches unless it's a terminal version. So you always have to keep this in mind when you're planning your upgrades, and you have to really do database upgrades every 18 months. A little bit of information about the database patches. One is they're always cumulative, so if you do get behind, you can always apply the latest CPU patch, even though you may have never applied a database CPU patch. As long as you're on the right version, and you probably, if you haven't applied CPU patches, you're probably on an older version, so you might have to do a database version upgrade. But once you apply the latest CPU patch, it covers all previous CPU patches. And another big question that we always get is, how do you test the database CPU patches? And our recommended testing is to do the same testing that you're doing for a minor version upgrade. So if you went from 11.203 to 11.204 and you have a test plan, that test plan is very applicable to a CPU patch. The CPU patches tend not to change a lot. And as we discussed about it, like a buffer overflow, it may be in a single library. So this quarter, when you look through the actual database CPU patch, there are 2 library files fixed, and that's it. So there's really not a lot that's changing, and the changes to those 2 libraries are really only someone went in and said, well, this piece of code shouldn't have been accepting anything over 100 characters, so we'll actually just put a limit on anything over 100 characters. Well, that in any rational environment, if someone's not trying to break it, it should never be passed. It may be like an object name. Well, object names can't be over 255 characters, and the programmer never thought about that. And so what happened was you could send 512 characters and cause a buffer overflow. Well, the change that Oracle put in was, well, object names can be 255 characters, so we'll just limit it to 255 characters and truncate everything else. And so there's no really reason that you should ever do that, except if you're trying to exploit a security vulnerability. And so those are the kind of changes that Oracle is making in many, many of the security vulnerabilities. And that's why the testing requirements are very minimal. Another aspect of the database patches for an eBusiness Suite environment is, as we saw, I have to be able to connect to the database to exploit a database vulnerability. If I can't connect to the database, I can't exploit the database. Therefore, if you can't apply the patches using Oracle's Managed SQLNet Access feature, or also now the Oracle Configuration Manager, Oracle Connection Manager supported, so you can actually limit connections to the database that way by SQL or by IP address. So if you can't apply patches to mitigate risk, if you don't let people connect to your database, you really don't have to apply patches because it's very difficult to exploit any security vulnerabilities in the database. So that's one option, is if you do have a hard time applying database security patches for some reason, business requirements, application upgrade requirements, things like that, trying to limit access to the database will reduce your risk dramatically. Another area we get a lot of questions regarding is the patch set updates. So Oracle has critical patch updates and patch set updates. They come out at the same time every quarter. And the difference between a critical patch update and the patch set update is a critical patch update is only security fixes. The patch set update includes both security fixes and things that have been determined to be critical fixes by Oracle. And usually a critical fix is a database crash, a corruption, something that's truly a bug that causes problems. Very seldom is there anything that would require a configuration change or change the way the database works, such as improving the optimizer, things like that. The nice thing about the patch set updates is, well, they include low-risk, high-value content. And how we describe it to customers is if you're applying one-off database patches regularly, you should be looking at patch set updates. If you don't know what a one-off database patch is because you've never had a database corruption or some weird performance problem because there's some bug in SQL, well, patch set updates probably won't provide you a lot of benefit. The risk with Oracle patch set updates is there was a lot of other stuff in them. So we took the July 2011 CPU and PSU for 11.202 and actually added up all the bug fixes. So for the CPU, because it's cumulative, it included 15 security fixes, I think it was for the last 3 or 4 quarters. So with 15 security fixes, well, for the PSU, you included those 15 security fixes, and then you got another 95 non-security fixes included. That's a lot of fixes. So if you're willing to take that risk that something else might change, or you're actually encountering a lot of those bugs and would like to just apply them all at once and so you don't have to encounter them, the PSU does make sense. But for most eBusiness Suite environments, we don't see that happening. For data warehouse environments and other very high-performance environments, they tend to apply database one-off patches. But unless you're running high-end payroll or something like that, most Oracle eBusiness Suite environments don't apply a lot of one-off patches. Another worry about the patch set updates is they are not tested by the Oracle eBusiness Suite development team. They're supported, but they don't actually test them. They fully test CPU patches, but they don't actually include as part of their testing cycles PSUs. Then one more aspect of the PSU is PSUs are minor version upgrades. So once you apply a PSU, you have to keep applying PSUs until you do a database upgrade. So if you're on 11.202 and you apply a PSU, until you go to 11.203, you always have to apply PSUs. There's no apply PSU one quarter, apply a CPU, apply a PSU, a CPU. No, you have to always apply PSUs. You can apply a PSU on top of any CPUs. So if you're doing CPUs up till now and now decide this quarter to do a PSU, you can do that. But once you do a database upgrade, this resets. So once you go to 11.202 to 11.203, you can actually then make the decision to do CPUs or PSUs again. So again, our recommendation is if you're doing CPUs today and don't know what database one-off patches are or don't apply them very often, stay with the CPUs. It's probably a little bit lower risk. But if you do have some performance issues and you're constantly finding database one-off patches, having to get into merge patches and things like that, the PSUs actually probably provide some benefit. And by the way, Oracle support will be pushing you actively towards PSUs. They want to get proactive patches into everyone's environment as much as possible. So if you talk to Oracle support, they would say, oh, definitely 100% PSUs and don't worry about CPUs. But that's Oracle support really trying to proactively push patches as much as possible. Another question we often get with CPUs is how do I know the CPU has been applied? And there's a couple of different ways to do it. Our strongly recommended method is there's actually a table, sys registry $history, that's been around since 2006 that will actually contain one row for the most recent CPU patch. It does not keep a history of CPU patches, it only keeps the most recent. So depending on platform and version, it may delete the old rows out of this table, but it will actually always have the most recent one. And so I've included the query here, and this presentation will be up on our website after, and you'll also get an email with a link to the presentation. So it's a very easy query to figure out what's the latest CPU applied in your environment. This table will also contain a PSU row too if you're applying PSUs. The reason we recommend registry $history versus looking at the Oracle inventory or other places is the CPU process is a two-part process. You have to apply OPatch. So you go to the operating system level and you run OPatch, and that updates the Oracle home. But as part of the CPU patching, you then have to run cat CPU SQL. And cat CPU SQL will update the database packages, change some permissions, and do some other things in the database. So the CPU is not fully applied until you've done both steps. At the last thing that happens during the cat CPU SQL is actually updating the registry $history table. So if this table has been updated with the most recent CPU, you're pretty much assured that the CPU was applied correctly, but that both steps were done, and the cat CPU SQL did not blow up and stop running at some point during its when it was applied. So that's why we recommend registry $history. Even though if you look at some websites and blog posts, they really say, oh yeah, just look at the Oracle inventory. And we don't feel that's reliable enough to tell you exactly if the CPU is both applied and applied correctly. And this one's also a little bit easier because the information is easier to look at in registry $history versus the Oracle inventory that just tells you a patch number. So that's a little bit about the database patches. So again, for an Oracle eBusiness Suite environment, you need a database patch, an application server patch, and an eBusiness Suite patch. So for the application server patches, these are the different versions of the Oracle application server supported for different versions of the eBusiness Suite and what has to be applied. And fortunately for this quarter, only if you're running 10.1.2.3 do you actually have to apply an application server patch. None of the vulnerabilities this quarter impact any of the other application server versions. One note here, if you're running 10.1.2.3, this is actually the last quarter that you can actually apply for that version. You'll have to do an application server upgrade in the near future. One of the questions we do frequently get is for the application server versions for 11i. As you can tell from this chart, they haven't been updated since January 2007 for the application server, or developer 6i is October 2008. And the question always, oh, isn't there some vulnerabilities in that? Fortunately, since the release of those versions and what is included in those versions, really the only security vulnerabilities that would be impacted by those would actually be in the Oracle HTTP server, which is a version of Apache. And it's basically just rebundled from the actual Apache 1.3 code. And since January 2007, there's only been one security vulnerability that would actually impact Apache 1.3. And based on circumstances, Oracle's version was not vulnerable. So even though there's been many, many application server patches since 1.0222's last patch, there's actually no security vulnerabilities that impact that version. That being said, if a vulnerability does come up in the future, we're not confident that Oracle would patch it for 11i because the version is so old. And Oracle technically supports it, but I don't even know if they actually go through and check if that Apache version is still certified or not. They say it is, but I don't think they're actually looking for bugs in it. That's a little bit about the application server. So that's kind of the basis of the application server. Fortunately, there hasn't been a lot of bugs to be fixed there recently for the eBusiness suite. If you're running application server for other things, there are a lot more bugs that would impact non-eBusiness suite environments. So you do have to keep aware that what's in the eBusiness suite and used by the eBusiness suite is a little bit different for the Fusion middleware or Oracle application server than for if you're running a full SOA suite or something like that. So now let's shift to the third piece. So we talked about the database and the application server, now about the Oracle Business Suite. Again, when we're talking about Oracle critical patch updates, Oracle is pushing its customers as aggressively as possible to stay on current versions. This makes sense from a business perspective for them as much as possible. If everyone's on the most recent version, it makes their support a lot easier. They only have to create patches and backward patches for a limited set of versions. It really helps them, decreases their development time, decreases their support costs and things like that. And so that's one reason they push this as aggressively as they do. So the baselines required for applying CPU patches to Oracle eBusiness Suite are pretty aggressive. So you have to be on Oracle eBusiness Suite 11i, RUP 6, or RUP 7. And you have to also adhere to the new extended support baselines. So if you go through the extended support baselines, it's really 11.5.10 CU2, RUP 6, RUP 7, and some additional patches. It's pretty aggressive. And that's only versions that they support and certify to run the CPUs against. Some of our customers report that they can actually apply the CPU patches without any problems. Other people run into tons of problems. So we do recommend trying to stay with the baseline because you're then running in a completely unsupported untested configuration. The same things happen with our 12 environments. So for 12.0, you have to be on 12.04 and now have the ATG 12.06. And if you're not familiar with kind of the ATG patches, those are basically equivalent to the RUP patches in 11i. So you have to be on 12.04, but really apply the FND, workflow, ICX, all those common modules have to be upgraded to at least 12.06. And then the same thing with 12.1. Now it's 12.1.1, but you actually have to have ATG 12.1.2. And Oracle will kind of keep pushing this, and you'll kind of see these numbers increment gradually over time as the 18-month window moves forward. So pretty soon it'll be 12.1.2 will be required in 12.06 for it. Probably April 2012, July 2012 will be the dates when those are required. As we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, now all the Oracle Business Suite patches are cumulative and only cumulative. there's only one little caveat to that. Some of the patches are actually almost cumulative. If you start reading through some of the readmes, especially on 11i, there are some prerequisite and post-requisite patches that are required for specific modules. So as you're applying the cumulative patches, you'll actually go through and you'll see on occasion that you need some other patches. Typically one-off CPU patches that aren't included in the cumulative patches if you're behind. If you're up to date, the most recent cumulative patch will work, but if you get far behind, 12 to 18 months behind on the CPU patches, it becomes a little bit more difficult because you have to apply a cumulative patch, then you have to go through each quarter and pick out one or two patches that may have to be applied. I think we had one customer recently who was 18 months behind on 11i. They applied the most recent cumulative patch, and they had to apply 12 one-off patches in addition to the cumulative patch. So they're cumulative up to a certain point. So always keep that in mind. So now let's quickly go through some of the specific vulnerabilities this quarter. All the vulnerabilities this quarter apply to the application object library, so basically FND, and in different parts of it. So it's kind of an interesting quarter on some of the vulnerabilities. And so one of the things that we go through is we're looking for three key aspects as we analyze each vulnerability. One, is it remotely exploitable without authentication? What testing is required? Because Oracle doesn't provide that information. They just say apply this patch and it'll tell you what you have to test. And the third thing is it blocked by the URL firewall, or is it externally available if you're running an external module like iSupply or iRecruitment, iStore? So that we go through, I'll touch on those 3 points. So the first vulnerability is in some of the common OA framework underlying technology called Marlin. There's Cabo and Marlin. And some of these vulnerabilities are some cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in Marlin. And so basically, these are all fully available externally, so they're not blocked by the URL firewall. Since it's a fairly rudimentary change, really minimal testing of the OA framework is required. And when we talk about minimal testing, we're just saying, well, just go in, make sure it works, kind of sign in, pick a few functions, things like that. There's really no rigorous testing required. This is recommended for all implementations and would not be blocked by the URL firewall. The second vulnerability is in the Oracle EBusiness Suite Online Help. This is specific to our 12, 12.0, and 12.1. Again, remotely exploitable without authentication. So if you're running iSupply or iRecruitment, this most likely will be accessible. Some environments do block the online help. So if you're blocking the online help in the URL firewall, which is an optional item, it would be blocked. There's really no specific testing. Our understanding of this bug is that it's actually fairly benign and deep down in the code. So we would suggest you may look at the online help if it comes up, but really there's nothing specific that you need to test. So the next two bugs, the next one is in single sign-on. This is specific to if you're running single sign-on. If you're not running single sign-on, we don't believe it's actually exploitable. So, but again, it's remotely exploitable and it's not blocked by the URL firewall. We recommend it at least for all single sign-on, and since it's a cumulative patch, you have to apply it anyway, so you'll get it in all environments. And the thing you need to test is you want to make sure that single sign-on is working correctly. So standard flow testing. So basically, can you sign on with several different single sign-on accounts? The next vulnerability is specific to attachments and file uploads, and it's actually in the common attachments and file uploads. So that's used by a number of different modules. So one example would be in iRecruitment where I'm uploading my resume. So again, it's not blocked by the URL firewall, and you need to test every piece and every module that you're using that would do file attachments and file uploads. You do have to be signed on with an account, but in that case, if I'm running something like iRecruitment, which is available on the internet, well, yeah, I need authentication, but I can create my own account and go in as iRecruitment as kind of a guest self-registered user. So it's remotely exploitable without authentication because I can create my own account in certain circumstances. And then finally, the last vulnerability is in a very specific service that was actually released as part of 12.1.2. So anything prior to 12.1.2, this actually REST framework doesn't exist. And Oracle has released a capability for REST services. And these are basically web services, SOA type things that you can kind of pull data out of the Oracle EBusiness Suite. This does need authentication. and only if you're really using the REST services if they're configured would this be exploitable. We do suggest it for all implementations because you never know when someone's going to turn it on one day, and then it would be standardly blocked by the URL firewall. We could see some occasions where a customer might want this remotely available. Then in that case, you would have to write a custom URL firewall. Well, from a security perspective, we wouldn't recommend that, but we think we have one customer who actually did that. So we are recommending that this would not be, especially because it's kind of a very strong service that you can do a lot of different things once you get access to it. So that's kind of a brief overview of some of the vulnerabilities, just kind of give you an idea of what's fixed and what testing would be required for each vulnerability. But since the patches are cumulative, you have to apply them all. But to give you an idea of some of the services that need to be tested and things like that, and some of the considerations if you're running externally and how quickly you'd want to apply these patches. So that's kind of a brief overview of the vulnerabilities and patches for this quarter. And now what we're going to talk about is a little bit of a patching strategy that's different than Oracle's. One of the things that we do at Integrity is every time we do a security assessment, we take some of that data and try to understand what all our clients are doing and where some of their pain points are, how are they keeping up with things like security patches. And then we kind of provide some summary information so we can better dedicate our services and direct customers to what they should be doing. So this graph here shows for about 120 production databases, mostly Oracle EBusiness Suite, and a few SAP and PeopleSoft, how many months behind is the client on security patches. And as you can see, very few people apply the security patches within 30 days. You get a couple instances where it's within 30 to 60 days, and a few more 30 to 90 or 60 to 90 days. And at kind of 9 months, you kind of get a spike. And those are kind of best practices. So you're applying it within 90 days. And so the goal here, and what a number of our larger customers have done, is they've gone to what they call an N-1 patching strategy. So by the time the next CPU comes out, you've got the last CPU in. So the timing would be, well, I've got the CPU released. I take about 2 weeks to make sure Oracle doesn't reload the patches, and then I get in my test environments. I spend 2 weeks maybe in a couple different test environments. I apply it to my final test or QA environment, and then within that 90 days, I've got it applied to production. As you can see, a number of clients are not on that type of cycle. They're kind of 24 months, and usually they're applying the patches as part of some sort of upgrade strategy. And then you can see at the end, a number of people haven't applied them in 4 years. So you can kind of see where you might lie on a typical distribution of actually what people are doing. Again, our recommendation is to get it within that 9-month cycle, and preferably within 3 months. So what's the best way to do that? Oracle's recommendation is apply all the patches ASAP. That's not realistic for most Oracle customers. The patches need some testing, especially now that the EBusiness Suite patches are all cumulative. What should you be doing? Our recommendation is to break up each patch, because each CPU, each EBusiness Suite environment would need 3 different patches: the database patch, EBusiness Suite patch, and application server patch. Well, the easiest patch to apply is really the database patch. It's the most tested, it has the most benign changes, and you can get it in fairly quickly. And it remediates most of the key vulnerabilities that if someone's going to come after you, they'll most likely be using the database security vulnerabilities. And so you can usually get this one applied first, and that's kind of our recommendation. Think about applying the database patches immediately, as quickly as possible, and get that in your environment, because that's where typically the most high-risk vulnerabilities are. The vulnerabilities that are published out on the internet with exploit code are almost always database patch vulnerabilities, and you can get it in easiest. And then the next thing to look at is EBusiness Suite patches. Really evaluate those patches and say, okay, we can get this cumulative patch in, or we might be running on the internet. There might be a severe ISO or ICE supplier vulnerability, or in this case, a number of application object library vulnerabilities that are all exploitable if I'm running iSupplier or iRecruitment, and look to get that cumulative patch in next, maybe during your next major patching window, which should be maybe every 6 months or hopefully sooner. And then the patches that tend to have the least risk and also the most effort are really the application server patches. Anyone who's ever applied a developer 6i patch knows that the invoice entry workbench tends to break when you apply developer 6i patches and probably requires the most testing. So what we do, and when we evaluate the patches over time and very much historically over all the CPUs, the application server patches tend to cause the most problems, require the most testing. So really look at applying those patches every 12 or 18 months when you're doing other upgrades. So Integrity publishes out this information every quarter. We publish it out on for free on our website at integrity.com. So if you need more information, you can always look there. So that's kind of a little bit different idea on how to apply the patches, how to break them up. There is really no dependencies between the database, EBusiness Suite, and the application server patches. You can really apply them one-off and really don't follow Oracle's recommendation. And if you can get the database patches in first, that really provides the most risk mitigation. So that was kind of a brief overview of the Oracle Critical Patch Update for October 2011. I'll give you a little bit of information on the impact it has on the eBusiness Suite and some specific guidance and recommendations with regard to the vulnerabilities and how to patch. So next we'll open up the questions and answers. So if anyone on today wants more information on the database impact specifically, what we do is we give another webinar next week that will actually go through. It's actually on Thursday, not Tuesday there. Sorry about that. On Thursday, November 3rd, and we actually go a little bit more detail specifically on the Oracle database, a few more kind of scenarios, a little bit more in-depth look at the database vulnerability, so if you want more information there. And so I'll turn it back to Phil to see if there's any questions.
All right, thank you, Steve. We've had several submitted here. Let me start off here. Oracle announces security fixes for the Fusion middleware, including Apache 2.0, but not 1.3, which is in all of the EBS releases. Do you know if they provide these fixes with a different patch, or are there not any issues with Apache 1.3?
So as we kind of went through and looked at the Oracle Application Server patch, for 11i, the last patch was January 2007, and there had been no specific Apache-related security bugs since the release of that. And Apache 1.3 has actually been pretty stable over time, and there have been maybe a dozen, maybe even 24, at least 12 to 24 different security bugs in Apache 1.3 since then. But fortunately, the Apache install for 11i especially didn't include a lot of extra modules and things that all those security vulnerabilities were impacting. The most recent security bug was actually a fairly powerful denial of service where you could actually bring down the entire application server by overutilizing the CPU. That did not impact the actual Oracle eBusiness Suite Apache version 1.3. It did impact 2.0, but not 1.3. So there have been a lot of vulnerabilities, unfortunately, for the eBusiness Suite in Apache 1.3. Nothing has impacted it.
Okay. Next one. What benefit do you get by applying CPU patches if you're in the process of upgrading to R12?
So whenever you're looking at CPU patches and doing upgrades of any kind, so either the application or the database, whenever you do an upgrade, always apply the latest CPU, because as we kind of went through the chart, the different versions include a baseline patch. So when you do your upgrade and you upgrade to 12.1.3, even though you have applied the most recent CPU, you have to reapply it because that upgrade will reset the code and replace code with vulnerable code, especially when you're doing an 11i to an R12 upgrade, because the way the versioning works in all the files, if anyone's familiar with the version strings for all 11i code is 115. As soon as you run your upgrade, it'll actually replace the entire Oracle home or the Oracle Appletop with code that says 1.20 for the version string. And so you'll replace code that you fully patched and is fully secure with code that's completely vulnerable and needs to be patched. And that applies both for major upgrades and minor upgrades. So the rule of thumb for all DBAs is when you apply a major upgrade, always apply the latest CPU. It can't go wrong. It won't hurt you at all. It may take a few more minutes to apply, but it will always make sure that all security vulnerabilities are patched.
All right, next. What are the best practices for applying CPU patches for R12?
So best practices, we talked about our patching strategy. The best practice that we'd like to see our clients work on is immediately apply the database patch as soon as possible. That's really where your risk is. And then look at the next patching cycle you're doing. Some clients are on a quarterly release cycle in terms of just functionality. Apply the CPU patches during that type of cycle. Some people have trains and some people have release windows, things like that. If you can be on that type of cycle and get the CPU patches in on a reasonable time, that's the best way to do it, especially when you're trying to include it with other changes. Therefore, you're getting some sort of testing cycles. And a lot of the CPU patches are benign changes. Their changes are not normal functionality is what they're changing. There's really not a lot of functional changes involved. So very seldom is there an impact from a CPU patch, just based on the nature of the change. It's something that should have been happening anyways, and that's what got fixed. It wasn't a change in the way the security works at all. There are exceptions to that rule. Probably 95% of the changes are very simple, but 5% can be complex changes, add or change the way a certain functionality works. But those are really the exception to the rule.
The next one. What are the differences between CPUs and PSUs?
And the major difference between the CPUs and the PSUs is really the number of fixes involved. So as we kind of go through this chart again, when you apply to CPU, you got 15 security fixes. When you apply to PSU, you got 95 non-security fixes and those 15 security fixes. So PSUs have a lot of one-off type critical fixes, database corruptions, and things like that included. And it's really purely up to the DBA to determine, can I absorb all those other changes, and is that meaningful to me? Can I introduce that level of risk of making just more and more changes than I probably need to, just to get a CPU patch in? Some DBAs swear by PSU, some say, oh, I'll never apply a PSU. It really just depends. If you're applying one-off database patches and have to do that all the time, a PSU does make a lot of sense. But if you're not doing that, it does incorporate more risk in the patching cycle.
All right, thank you, Steve. I think that about wraps it up for the day. And again, I want to thank everybody for attending today's e-learning webinar.